Tonight, we uncover the hidden lineage of shapes, ratios, and patterns that have guided human hands for millennia. A secret preserved not in stories or myths, but in the guarded vaults of the Vatican. Sacred geometry, the invisible code behind cathedrals, city plans, and works of art, was never just decoration. It is a record of knowledge passed from Egypt to Greece, Rome to Byzantium, and finally into the hands of the Church, meticulously copied, catalogued, and protected. The Vatican did not simply preserve these manuscripts. They controlled them, deciding who could see, who could study, and who would remain in ignorance. Each compass stroke, each measured ratio, each vaulted ceiling holds a trace of truths the world was not meant to know. And those who sought to uncover the full story often encountered locked archives, labyrinthine bureaucracy, and silence so complete it could erase centuries. Tonight, we follow the hidden threads that connect architecture, mathematics, and theology, revealing a continuity that stretches across empires, secret societies, and human imagination. But be warned, the knowledge is not idle, and its story is as carefully measured as the structures it helped create. Before we dive into this hidden world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. For centuries, visitors have stood beneath vast rose windows, believing they were admiring beauty alone. Yet something quieter has always been present, something measured, repeated, and precise. The moment you stop seeing these windows as decoration and begin seeing them as diagrams, a pattern emerges across Europe. Cathedrals separated by hundreds of miles and built generations apart follow the same geometric logic, the same ratios, the same hidden order. This is not speculation. It is visible in surviving plans, stone markings, and written records left by medieval builders. Circles divided evenly, triangles locked into squares, and proportions that repeat again and again appear in places like Chartres, Notre Dame, Amiens, and Canterbury. The question is not whether this pattern exists, but why it was used so consistently. Medieval architects did not improvise these forms. They followed rules inherited from earlier traditions. Geometry in the Middle Ages was not mystical fantasy. It was practical knowledge taught as part of the quadrivium, alongside arithmetic, music, and astronomy. These disciplines were believed to reveal how order itself was structured. When a mason laid out a cathedral floor plan, he was not expressing personal creativity. He was applying ratios believed to reflect harmony in creation. Written sources from the 12th and 13th centuries confirm this. Thinkers like Hugh of St. Victor described geometry as essential to understanding the world because it trained the mind to recognize proportion and balance. Surviving sketchbooks, such as those attributed to Villard de Honnecourt, show clear geometric constructions used to design walls, towers, and windows. These drawings were tools, not symbols. The repetition across churches suggests a shared source of knowledge transmitted through guilds, monasteries, and cathedral schools. This knowledge did not originate in medieval Europe alone. Many of its principles can be traced back through Roman architectural texts, such as those by Vitruvius, who emphasize symmetry and proportion as foundations of building. Vitruvius himself drew on earlier Greek ideas rooted in mathematics rather than religion. Copies of his work survived in monastic libraries and were known long before the Renaissance. The Church did not invent these rules, but it preserved and applied them. The Vatican, as an institution, became a central holder of texts, diagrams, and educational traditions that carried this knowledge forward. Geometry was taught to those trained to use it, not to the general public. Over time, the meaning of these forms faded, while the forms themselves remained. Later generations saw mystery where earlier builders saw method. Rose windows in particular reveal this shift. Their complex symmetry is based on simple divisions of the circle, a form long associated with completeness, because it has no beginning or end. This idea predates Christianity, yet was adopted naturally into church design. What survives today is stone memory. The rules did not disappear, they became silent. In that silence, a question waits. If the same geometry appears again and again across centuries, then someone remembered something important and made sure it was never truly lost within sacred space itself. Sacred geometry is a phrase that today often sounds mystical, secretive, or supernatural, but historically it meant something far more grounded and practical. In the ancient and medieval world, geometry was the study of measure, proportion, and relationship. It was a way to understand spaceform and harmony. Long before it became associated with hidden symbols or spiritual codes, geometry was a working language used by builders, artists, surveyors, and scholars. When medieval thinkers spoke of geometry as sacred, they weren't claiming shapes had magic powers. They believed order itself was meaningful. Circles, squares, and triangles were valued because they expressed balance, clarity, and consistency. These forms were easy to reproduce, teach, and verify. They could be trusted. In early education systems, geometry was not optional. It was one of the 7 liberal arts taught to train the mind. Alongside arithmetic, music, and astronomy, geometry helped students recognize patterns that repeated across nature and human creation. This approach was inherited from Greek philosophy, especially the belief that the universe operated according to rational laws. Writers like Euclid, whose work, Elements, was composed around 300 years before Christ, presented geometry as a logical system built from simple truths. His text survived through Roman and later Christian copying traditions and became a foundation for architectural planning. When Christian scholars encountered these ideas, they did not reject them. They absorbed them. Proportion, symmetry, and harmony were seen as reflections of a rational creator, not as objects of worship themselves. This distinction is important. Sacred geometry in its historical sense was not about decoding hidden messages. It was about using reliable mathematical relationships to create structures that felt stable, ordered, and uplifting. Cathedrals felt inspiring because their proportions worked on the human eye and body. The spacing of columns, the height of vaults, and the division of windows followed ratios that created balance. Builders did not need mystical explanations. They relied on geometry because it worked. Over time, as education narrowed and fewer people understood these methods, the meaning shifted. What was once technical knowledge became symbolic in memory. Later generations, encountering these forms without understanding their construction, assumed they carried secret meaning. This is how modern overlays developed. But historically, sacred geometry was never separate from craft learning and reason. It was a bridge between mathematics and meaning, built on practice, not mystery. To understand its origins, we must strip away later myths and return to how geometry functioned as a shared language of order used openly and deliberately across centuries of human building and thought. Long before Christianity shaped Europe, the foundations of sacred geometry were already firmly in place, grounded not in mystery, but in survival, administration, and construction. In ancient Egypt, geometry emerged from the need to measure land after the yearly flooding of the Nile. Surveyors, known as rope stretchers, used knotted cords to create right angles, divide fields, and restore boundaries. These methods were practical, repeatable, and reliable. Over time, the same principles were applied to temple planning and monumental building. The pyramids built during the Old Kingdom around 2,500 years before Christ display precise orientation, alignment, and proportion. The Great Pyramid is aligned to the cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy, a result of careful observation and measurement, rather than symbolism alone. Rectangles, triangles, and slopes followed ratios that ensured stability and endurance. Egyptian builders did not describe this work as sacred geometry, but later cultures looking back would interpret meaning in what was originally technique. In Mesopotamia, geometry developed alongside writing trade and law. Clay tablets from cities like Sumer and Babylon, dating to around 2,000 years before Christ, show calculations for areas, volumes, and angles. These were used for canals, city walls, and ziggurats. Ziggurats themselves were stepped structures built with consistent ratios rising toward the sky, not as abstract symbols, but as engineered forms designed to bear weight and last generations. Mathematical tablets, such as Plimpton 322, reveal an understanding of right triangles centuries before Greek texts formalized them. This knowledge was embedded in daily work. Geometry was a tool for organizing space and authority. When temples and palaces followed consistent proportions, they communicated order and power. Over centuries, these practices became tradition. When later civilizations inherited the structures, but not always the full explanations, they attached meaning to the forms. A square came to represent Earth, a circle eternity. Not because the builders intended this, but because humans seek meaning in patterns. Egyptian and Mesopotamian geometry was later filtered through Greek philosophy, which transformed technique into theory. When Christianity later absorbed Greek learning, these early systems lay beneath the surface unseen, but active. The Vatican and other centers of learning inherited geometry already layered with centuries of use. What began as measurement became meaning through time, not design. Understanding this origin strips away modern fantasy and reveals a continuous human effort to shape the world using numbers, space, and reason long before sacred geometry had a name. In ancient Greece, geometry changed from a practical skill into a way of understanding reality itself. What Egyptians and Mesopotamians used to measure land and build temples, Greek thinkers began to question and explain. Around 600 years before, Christ figures like Pythagoras proposed that numbers were not just tools, but the hidden structure of the universe. To the Pythagoreans, harmony in music proportion, in shapes and balance in nature, all followed numerical relationships. This idea did not remain abstract. It shaped how Greeks thought about truth, order, and meaning. Geometry became a bridge between the visible world and an invisible logical one. Shapes were no longer just drawn, they were contemplated. A triangle was not only a form, it was an idea that could exist perfectly in the mind. This shift was critical. It meant geometry could be taught, written, and passed down independent of construction. The most influential result of this approach appeared around 300 years before Christ with Euclid of Alexandria. His work Elements did something revolutionary. It organized geometry into definitions, axioms, and logical proofs. Each statement followed from the last, creating a system that anyone trained could verify. There was no appeal to authority or religion, only reason. This made geometry universal. A circle drawn in Athens followed the same rules as one drawn anywhere else. Elements became one of the most copied texts in history. It survived through Greek, Roman, Islamic, and Christian worlds. Its influence reached builders, philosophers, and theologians alike. Plato further expanded the philosophical meaning of geometry. He believed that the material world was an imperfect reflection of ideal forms, and that geometry trained the mind to grasp these higher truths. In his academy, students were required to study geometry before philosophy. This was not symbolism, it was preparation. To think clearly, one had to understand proportion and logic. When later religious thinkers encountered Greek geometry, they inherited this worldview. Geometry was not opposed to belief it supported order. By the time Rome absorbed Greek learning, geometry was already seen as both practical and profound. This dual role mattered deeply. It allowed geometry to pass safely into later cultures, including Christianity. When the Vatican preserved Greek texts, they preserved not just diagrams, but a way of thinking that connected number space and meaning. The idea that geometry revealed something fundamental about reality did not originate with Christianity, but it fit comfortably within it. This is why geometric design remained central in sacred spaces, not because Greeks hid secrets, but because they taught the world to see order as truth. What modern audiences call sacred geometry is often a memory of this Greek transformation, where measurement became meaning, and lines on stone reflected a deeper belief that the universe itself could be understood through reason. Plato introduced an idea that permanently changed how geometry was understood by later civilizations, including Christian thinkers. He taught that the shapes we see in the physical world are imperfect copies of perfect forms that exist beyond matter. According to Plato, a circle drawn in sand is never truly perfect, but the idea of a perfect circle exists in a higher reality. This higher realm was not a place, but a level of truth accessible through reason. Geometry became the training ground for the mind to reach it. In dialogues written around 400 years before Christ, Plato repeatedly used geometric examples to explain knowledge, certainty, and order. To him, mathematics did not describe opinion, it described truth. This belief placed geometry in a unique position. It was no longer just a tool for building, but a key to understanding reality itself. Plato's academy famously required students to study geometry before entering philosophical debate. This was not symbolic tradition, but a belief that disciplined thinking began with proportion and form. Over time, this concept of ideal forms was absorbed by later thinkers who connected it with ideas of the divine. When early Christian philosophers encountered Plato's work, they recognized compatibility rather than conflict. If perfect forms existed beyond the physical world, then creation itself could be seen as ordered by a rational source. Geometry became evidence of design, not chance. This interpretation did not mean God was geometry, but that geometry revealed order placed into the world. Thinkers such as Augustine, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, adopted Platonic ideas carefully. Augustine argued that numbers and proportions were part of divine reason, and that humans could access this order through study. He did not claim shapes were sacred, objects, but that they reflected a higher logic. This distinction mattered. It allowed the Church to embrace geometry without superstition. Platonic solids also played a role in shaping later thought. Plato associated certain regular solids with elements not as physical claims, but as philosophical illustrations. Later generations simplified these ideas and attached symbolic meaning to shapes themselves. However, in their original context, they were teaching tools. The influence of Plato travelled through Roman education and into medieval Christian scholarship preserved in monastic libraries and cathedral schools. The Vatican, as a centre of learning, inherited these texts along with their interpretations. When medieval architects spoke of building according to divine proportion, they were often drawing from this Platonic framework filtered through Christian theology. A building that followed perfect ratios was seen as reflecting cosmic order. This did not require secret knowledge, only education. The idea of a divine blueprint did not mean a hidden plan kept by an institution. It meant that order itself was visible and understandable. Over centuries, this philosophical bridge allowed mathematics to remain central in sacred architecture. Modern ideas of sacred geometry often exaggerate this connection, but the historical reality is quieter. Plato did not preach mystery codes. He taught that truth could be known through reason, and geometry was one of its clearest expressions. Rome did not inherit geometry as philosophy alone, it turned it into action. Where Greek thinkers debated ideal forms, Roman engineers applied proportion to roads, bridges, aqueducts, and cities. This was not about revelation or spiritual mystery. It was about reliability. Roman builders needed systems that worked the same way everywhere, from Britain to North Africa. Geometry provided that system. Ratios determined the width of roads, the curve of arches, and the balance of domes. These rules were taught through practice manuals and apprenticeship, not temples. One of the most important sources was the architect Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century before Christ. His work, De Architectura, outlined principles of symmetry, proportion, and order that every educated builder was expected to know. Vitruvius argued that beauty came from proper ratio, not decoration. A building felt right when its parts related to each other mathematically. This idea spread wherever Roman influence reached. Cities followed grid plans, temples followed measured layouts, and public buildings repeated familiar forms. When Rome expanded, geometry expanded with it, embedded in stone. Even after the Western Roman Empire declined, these structures remained. Roads continued to guide travel. Aqueducts continued to shape cities, and ruins became classrooms for later builders. Geometry survived, not in theory, but in infrastructure. Early Christian architects inherited this environment. The first basilicas were adapted from Roman civic buildings using the same proportions and construction methods. There was no sudden sacred redesign. The church built using what already existed. Roman geometry quietly became Christian geometry without conflict. Copies of Vitruvius survived in monastic libraries and were studied throughout the Middle Ages, long before the Renaissance. His influence can be seen in the measured spacing of columns and the balanced elevations of churches. This continuity matters. It shows that geometry did not disappear and return. It stayed present through Roman practice. When later generations spoke of divine proportion, they were often describing ratios inherited from Roman engineering. The Vatican, as a centre of preservation, held these texts alongside theological works. They were not hidden secrets, but technical knowledge accessible to trained readers. Roman emphasis on ratio rather than revelation shaped how sacred spaces were later built. Geometry was trusted because it had proven itself over centuries of use. An arch stood because its curve followed known rules. A dome held because its weight was calculated. This reliability gave geometry authority. Over time, that authority was interpreted as meaning. What worked so well must reflect order itself. But originally it reflected experience. Rome did not build to express belief, it built to endure. In doing so, it left Europe a physical language of proportion that later ages would read as sacred, even though it began as practical reason written into stone. This legacy explains why geometric consistency appears across Europe. It was not imposed by doctrine, but inherited through roads, walls, and plans. Geometry survived because it solved problems. Long after emperors fell, the ratios remained guiding builders who trusted what history had already tested successfully when the Western Roman Empire weakened in the 5th century. After Christ, many later writers described the period as a collapse of knowledge. But this image is incomplete. Learning did not vanish overnight, it fractured. Some libraries were destroyed, some were abandoned, and others were quietly moved. Urban schools declined, but smaller networks survived in new forms. The most important of these were monasteries. As cities lost stability, monasteries offered continuity. They were among the few institutions that remained organized across generations. Monks were trained to read-write and copy texts as part of daily discipline. This made monasteries natural centers for preservation. What survived from antiquity did so largely because someone copied it by hand. Geometry texts, architectural treatises, and mathematical summaries did not disappear, they became rare. Copying a book could take months or years, so choices mattered. Monks copied what they believed was useful, meaningful, or necessary. Christian writings came first, but works on logic, mathematics, and natural philosophy were often included because they supported education. The quadrivium, which included geometry, remained part of monastic schooling. This ensured that core mathematical ideas stayed alive. Libraries shifted from public to private spaces. Instead of grand imperial collections, knowledge was stored in scriptoria behind monastery walls. This made access limited, but not secret. Learning became slower, but more deliberate. Texts moved along pilgrimage routes, trade paths, and missionary networks. Irish monasteries preserved Latin learning and carried it back into continental Europe. Benedictine houses formed interconnected communities that shared books through lending and copying. These networks were fragile but real. Geometry survived within them as diagrams, marginal notes, and teaching summaries. Builders and scholars did not read full ancient texts often, but they learned methods passed down through instruction. The Vatican, as an institution, did not yet exist in its later form, but the Church in Rome gradually became a gathering point for manuscripts. As papal authority grew, so did its collections. This was not a sudden act of control, but a result of stability. Where there was security, books gathered. Over centuries, these collections expanded, forming the foundation of later Vatican libraries. The idea that learning fully died ignores this quieter reality. Knowledge became thinner, but continuous. Geometry moved from public academies to cloisters, but it did not break. The same proportions used in Roman buildings continued to appear in early medieval churches because builders learned by example. Stone taught geometry when books were scarce. This period shaped how later generations understood the past. Gaps in records created the illusion of absence. In truth, learning changed shape. It withdrew from cities and concentrated in fewer hands. This concentration later gave institutions like the Vatican great responsibility. They inherited not a complete archive, but fragments carefully kept alive through copying. Sacred geometry survived not because it was hidden, but because it was useful. It helped build walls, vaults, and spaces of worship. As long as structures stood, the knowledge behind them remained present, even when few could explain its origins. In the Middle Ages, the survival of knowledge depended on human hands and careful decision-making. Monks in monasteries across Europe became the guardians of texts, copying manuscripts from antiquity to preserve them for the future. This process was painstaking. Each letter had to be reproduced by eye using quills ink and vellum or parchment. A single mistake could alter meaning and obscure understanding. Not every text was copied. Choices reflected what the monastery deemed useful doctrinally or educationally. Classical works on mathematics, astronomy, and architecture were preserved selectively, often alongside religious texts to ensure continued relevance. Geometry, for example, was copied not for magic, but because it trained the mind in order, proportion, and reasoning skills that supported study in the quadrivium. Many surviving manuscripts show evidence of marginal notes and diagrams added by scribes to clarify techniques for future readers. This suggests that copying was not mechanical, but interpretive. Monks adapted texts, sometimes correcting errors, sometimes clarifying unclear passages. Over centuries, these choices shaped what later generations could rediscover. A lost work might remain entirely unknown, while a fragment carefully preserved could influence architecture, design, or scientific thought centuries later. Libraries were limited and space precious. Each volume had to earn its place. This meant that the very survival of knowledge was filtered through the priorities of the scribes and the institutions that supported them. In the 8th century, for example, Irish monasteries became centres of preservation and learning, copying Greek and Roman texts that had survived migrations and invasions. These manuscripts travelled with monks across Europe, introducing classical knowledge to regions that had never seen it before. The act of copying created a network of intellectual continuity, despite political instability. The Vatican and other emerging centres of the Church would eventually inherit these collections, giving them broader custodial authority. However, this authority was built on the logic of preservation rather than censorship. Knowledge survived because it was copied systematically, not necessarily hidden. The patterns, ratios, and principles embedded in architectural and mathematical works passed from scribe to scribe, ensuring continuity even when cities fell or libraries were destroyed. This is why elements of Roman and Greek geometry reappeared in medieval cathedrals. Builders and scholars were often guided by surviving manuscripts, the echo of measurements and diagrams preserved across centuries. The monastic logic of preservation created a bridge connecting antiquity with the Renaissance and beyond. Every choice about what to copy and how to copy it shaped the future. What later generations would call sacred geometry, and what modern researchers now study in rose windows and cathedral plans, is in large part the result of these meticulous human decisions. The survival of knowledge was never guaranteed, but through the labour of scribes, texts endured. Their work ensured that the principles of proportion, symmetry, and harmony were not forgotten, but available for those who would later recognize their significance and apply them anew. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, maintained continuity that Western Europe temporarily lost. Constantinople became a center where Greek language, philosophy, and science survived with remarkable fidelity. The city's libraries, schools, and scholars preserved works of Euclid, Archimedes, Ptolemy, and other mathematicians, whose texts were often no longer accessible in the West. Manuscripts copied in Constantinople ensured that knowledge of proportion, geometry, and mechanics remained active and teachable. Byzantine scholars also annotated, commented, and occasionally expanded these works, maintaining a living tradition rather than simply storing old books. During the 6th century, Emperor Justinian commissioned legal and educational reforms that indirectly supported mathematical learning. His codices and the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia required precise calculations and the application of geometry on a grand scale, demonstrating that theoretical knowledge was linked to practical construction. The survival of Greek texts in Byzantium meant that when Western Europe experienced the monastic preservation system, it could draw on a reservoir of learning through contacts with the East. Beginning in the 9th century, as missionary activity and trade increased, copies of Greek and Arabic translations began arriving in Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. These manuscripts included Euclidean geometry, the works of Ptolemy on astronomy, and treatises on optics and proportion. Italian city-states, especially Venice and Amalfi, became conduits for Byzantine knowledge. Merchants and scholars traveling for commerce or diplomacy often carried texts, enabling Western European schools and cathedral builders to re-encounter the mathematical rules necessary for precise architecture. This transmission was not accidental. Scholars in Constantinople understood the value of preserving and sharing knowledge and occasionally sent students or copies westward to maintain cultural influence. The continuity also allowed for later Renaissance humanists to access Greek sources directly or through Arabic intermediaries, ensuring that Plato, Aristotle, and Euclid would inform the renewed European focus on proportion, symmetry, and mathematical design. Byzantine manuscripts were often richly annotated, showing how ratios, divisions, and geometric principles were applied in art, construction, and engineering. These annotations provided practical examples that complemented theoretical study, forming a bridge between abstract mathematics and real-world implementation. Without Byzantium, much of this knowledge would have been delayed or lost entirely to Western Europe. When the Vatican and European monastic libraries began consolidating texts in the 11th and 12th centuries, they did so knowing the Greek thread persisted in the East. This thread connected past achievements with the new architectural ambitions of Gothic and Romanesque builders. Sacred geometry, as understood in Western Europe, depended not only on local copying, but also on this Eastern lifeline that maintained accuracy, commentary, and application of Greek mathematical thought. Constantinople ensured that ratios, proportions, and the logic of forms survived intact, so that centuries later, European builders could apply these principles consciously rather than through guesswork or folklore. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate established Baghdad as a center of learning unmatched in the medieval world. The House of Wisdom, founded under Caliph Harun al-Rashid and expanded by his successors, became a hub where Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic. Works of Euclid, Ptolemy, Archimedes, and other mathematicians were not only preserved, but systematized, annotated, and expanded with new observations. Scholars like al-Khwarizmi, who lived around 875 to 848, developed algebra and advanced arithmetic using these Greek sources. Geometry, ratios, and mathematical reasoning were refined and taught alongside astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Baghdad became a laboratory where abstract Greek knowledge gained practical applications in engineering, architecture, and navigation. The translation movement ensured that texts once lost or inaccessible to Western Europe were not only preserved, but enhanced. Innovations in decimal notation, algorithms, and methods for calculating areas and volumes circulated widely within the Islamic world. Over centuries, traders, diplomats, and scholars carried these works westward into Spain, Sicily, and eventually Italy. In the 11th and 12th centuries, during the Reconquista and the rise of European universities, Arabic texts were translated into Latin, reintroducing Greek mathematics enriched by centuries of Islamic scholarship. Works on optics, proportion, and geometry informed cathedral construction, military engineering, and scientific study. This transmission was selective and often mediated through translations of translations, but the principles survived intact. The geometry used in Gothic windows, domes, and arches reflects not only Roman inheritance, but also refinements absorbed from Arabic mathematics. The logic of proportion, the calculations for curves and angles, and the systematic approach to problem-solving in architecture and design often trace back to this Baghdad tradition. Even knowledge of Platonic solids and Euclidean constructions reached Europe through these channels. Beyond mathematics, Baghdad provided examples of institutional learning, libraries, and organized study, showing that preservation required both effort and infrastructure. Western Europe, recovering from centuries of fragmentation, benefited from this structured approach to scholarship. Monks and early universities could copy, adapt, and apply techniques that had already been refined over hundreds of years. The Abbasid translation movement demonstrates that knowledge is rarely linear. Greek ideas survived because Byzantium preserved texts locally, Baghdad refined them systematically, and later Europe selectively reintroduced them. Sacred geometry, as applied in medieval churches and later Renaissance buildings, depended on this long chain of preservation, translation, and adaptation. Without Baghdad's role as a hub of translation and mathematical innovation, the rules, ratios, and diagrams that guided European construction might have been delayed or lost entirely. This centuries-long transmission underscores how interconnected cultures preserved and transmitted the mathematical foundations that continue to shape our understanding of proportion and design. By the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ, Christian thinkers began integrating the mathematical ideas inherited from Greek and Roman sources into theology without resistance. They recognized that numbers, ratios, and geometric forms could express divine order rather than conflict with faith. Figures like Augustine of Hippo, writing around 430, emphasized that the universe followed a rational structure established by God. Geometry, proportion, and symmetry were therefore evidence of intelligent design rather than secular curiosity. Monastic scholars copied and studied works on arithmetic and geometry alongside theological texts, creating a seamless intellectual environment where mathematics reinforced spiritual understanding. The concept of the quadrivium, taught in cathedral and monastic schools, placed arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy at the center of education. These subjects trained the mind to recognize order, pattern, and proportion, preparing students to understand scripture and the created world. numbers became a language of creation. Architects planning churches and cathedrals did not merely build for beauty or ritual. They applied geometric principles to reflect cosmic order. Ratios determined the spacing of columns, the height of vaults, and the curvature of arches, producing structures that felt harmonious and stable. This integration of mathematics into sacred spaces reinforced the idea that the world itself was a manifestation of divine intelligence. Christian scholars also studied the writings of Boethius around 500, who translated and commented on Greek works, bridging philosophical and theological thought. Music theory, tied to numerical ratios, was taught as part of understanding harmony both in sound and in space. Numbers and geometry became tools for contemplating God's creation, not instruments of rebellion or heresy. The Church did not forbid the study of mathematics. It encouraged it as a means to understand the rational order established by a creator. Through this framework, proportion and symmetry gained spiritual significance. The design of a rose window or the plan of a basilica was more than artistic choice. It communicated the stability, balance, and perfection inherent in the universe. Monks who preserved Greek and Roman manuscripts also annotated them to align with theological interpretation, ensuring that the knowledge could be used to support faith. Over time, these ideas became embedded in cathedral schools and later universities. When Gothic cathedrals arose in the 12th century, builders applied centuries of learned ratios, geometric constructions, and mathematical harmonies inherited from classical sources and filtered through Christian thought. Numbers and forms were no longer neutral tools. They were carriers of meaning, illustrating that creation was ordered, intelligible, and harmonious. Christian Europe absorbed these principles naturally, showing that intellectual and spiritual development could advance simultaneously. Sacred geometry, as a concept, thrived because mathematics was accepted as a reflection of divine logic. The rationality of numbers became an ally of theology, providing both method and message. Every measured arch and proportioned plan silently conveyed this principle to all who entered the spaces. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, provided a framework for understanding measure, proportion, and order, without attributing magical qualities to geometry. He argued that numbers and ratios revealed the rational structure of creation, and offered humans a way to comprehend divine wisdom. In his work, De Doctrina Christiana, he emphasized that learning mathematics trained the mind to recognize patterns, reason logically, and appreciate harmony in both the physical and spiritual world. Augustine and his contemporaries viewed geometry not as a mystical art, but as a disciplined practice capable of illustrating order, balance, and proportion in creation. This approach influenced the Christian intellectual tradition throughout the early and high Middle Ages. Monastic schools adopted arithmetic, geometry, and the other liberal arts to develop mental clarity, not to promote superstition. When scribes copied Euclid, Boethius, or Pythagorean texts, they preserved methods for calculating lengths, areas, and ratios that could be applied to construction, music, and astronomical study. The precision in these works was respected because it reflected a logical universe, one shaped by a rational creator, rather than secret knowledge. In cathedral design, these principles guided builders in practical ways. The height of a nave, the width of aisles, and the division of windows were determined using ratios derived from inherited Greek and Roman mathematics. The resulting structures were visually harmonious and structurally sound. Rose windows and vaults followed measurable patterns that communicated balance and order. This careful use of geometry demonstrated an understanding of proportion as meaningful, without implying that the shapes themselves possessed magical properties. Monastic commentaries often highlighted symbolic interpretations, such as the circle representing completeness or eternity, but these symbols were illustrative tools rather than sources of supernatural power. This balance between technical skill and symbolic meaning became a hallmark of medieval intellectual culture. Christian scholars recognized that measure and proportion could convey spiritual ideas indirectly while remaining grounded in mathematics. The study of geometry trained both eye and mind to detect harmony, facilitating an appreciation for divine creation through observable order. Libraries across Europe, including those that would later feed into the Vatican collections, preserved these texts along with commentaries and practical notes on applying ratios and measures in building and art. The methodology emphasized calculation, repetition, and verification rather than intuition or secret wisdom. Augustine's influence extended through cathedral schools, monastic instruction, and the educational curriculum that shaped European thought for centuries. Geometry became a language for understanding the world, a set of tools for reasoning and creating, and a framework for reflecting the rationality of God's design. Sacred geometry in this sense is the product of careful measurement, deliberate proportion, and disciplined application. It was a system both practical and meaningful, ensuring that knowledge survived, structures were stable, and spiritual ideas could be communicated visually without ever claiming magic or mystical powers. This approach allowed medieval Europe to inherit and build upon classical traditions responsibly and consistently, creating a continuous line from ancient mathematics to Gothic architecture. Medieval cathedrals are often described as beautiful or awe-inspiring, but beneath the surface of their soaring vaults and intricate rose windows lies a strict application of mathematics. Builders used grids, ratios, and geometric modules to plan every element, ensuring that walls, columns, and arches aligned in harmonious proportions. These techniques were inherited from Roman engineering, refined through monastic scholarship, and reinforced by the study of Euclid and other classical mathematicians preserved in monastic libraries. A cathedral floor plan was rarely drawn freehand. Builders relied on geometric modules, often squares or circles subdivided according to simple ratios, to scale the building accurately. The repetition of these ratios produced coherence throughout the structure, making it visually balanced and structurally sound. The famous Chartres Cathedral in France, begun in the 12th century, demonstrates this approach. Measurements of the nave, transept, and choir follow proportional relationships that repeat in windows, vaults, and even the spacing of columns. Builders often use the square root of 2 or the golden ratio to guide these divisions, producing spaces that feel naturally harmonious. Rose windows were not mere decoration. Their radial symmetry reflects careful calculation, ensuring that light passing through creates patterns that complement the interior proportions. Every arc, every segment, and every intersection was the product of measurement and observation, not intuition or guesswork. Builders also employed simple tools such as measuring rods, ropes, and compasses to translate geometric plans from paper or parchment to stone. These instruments allowed the replication of proportional systems across entire complexes, so that vaults aligned with walls and portals mirrored window dimensions. The coherence of these structures is why they appear transcendent. The human eye recognizes balance and order even without understanding the calculations behind it. This practical use of geometry reinforced the intellectual education of masons and architects, who learned to think in modules, ratios, and lines. They became adept not only at construction, but at visualizing relationships between parts and whole. Gothic and Romanesque cathedrals served as lessons in mathematics for the trained eye. Clerics, students, and visitors could observe proportion in practice, linking physical experience with theoretical understanding. Unlike modern architecture, which often separates design from mathematical instruction, medieval cathedrals integrated teaching into every stone. The repetition of geometric modules ensured consistency. The scaling of ratios guided aesthetic decisions, and the attention to proportion preserved structural integrity. This system also allowed builders to adapt plans as projects expanded over decades or centuries, maintaining harmony despite multiple architects contributing over time. In essence, the cathedral functioned as a three-dimensional textbook in geometry, demonstrating how measure, proportion, and order could be applied practically while communicating beauty and sacred meaning. Sacred geometry was not an abstract or mystical doctrine, but a method that shaped human perception through carefully executed mathematical principles. The structures endure today as evidence of this disciplined and coherent approach, revealing that medieval builders were mathematicians as much as artisans, and that every vaulted ceiling and patterned window carries centuries of inherited knowledge translated into stone. Medieval builders translated mathematical ideals into physical structures using simple but precise tools. The compass, square, plumb line, and measuring rod allowed masons to apply ratios, angles, and proportional modules reliably across large constructions. These tools were essential because drawings were often small or symbolic, and measurements had to scale accurately on site. Apprentices learned to read geometric diagrams and translate them into full-scale layouts, ensuring that walls, vaults, and arches followed intended proportions. Construction began with a carefully laid foundation, often marked with ropes to outline grids and modules. Squares and circles were drawn directly on the ground, establishing reference points for height, width, and alignment. These markings guided the placement of every column, pillar, and pier. As masons erected scaffolding and raised walls, they continually checked angles with the square and plumb line, ensuring verticals and horizontals matched the design. Vaults were developed using templates traced from geometric constructions, allowing consistent curvature across wide spans. The pointed arches of Gothic cathedrals relied on the intersection of circles constructed with compasses, producing shapes that distributed weight efficiently while creating the appearance of height and lightness. Rose windows and tracery were planned on paper or parchment, but realized with strings, compasses, and rulers, translating small-scale designs into monumental stone. Each element reinforced the underlying geometric system, so that even when projects took decades and multiple builders, coherence persisted. Craftsmen often use proportional rods or modules derived from units of measurement consistent with the human body or local standards. These modules allowed scaling of designs from drawing to construction and ensured that ratios remained harmonious across the structure. Collaboration was essential. Master masons coordinated teams of stonecutters, carpenters, and apprentices each contributing to executing the geometric plan while preserving accuracy. Notes and sketches in mason's marks sometimes recorded dimensions, angles, and alignments for later reference. The integration of theory and practice meant that geometry was not abstract, but lived through tools, measurements, and repetition. Builders did not rely on guesswork. They applied centuries of accumulated knowledge, from Roman engineering to Greek mathematical principles preserved in Byzantine and monastic libraries. Every curve, arch, and vault was tested against the logic of proportion, ensuring stability and aesthetic unity. This practical application demonstrates that sacred geometry was embedded in craft. It was not hidden knowledge or mystical magic, but a disciplined method, using simple instruments to achieve complex outcomes. The choir, the nave, and the flying buttresses were all the product of these methods. By mastering tools and geometric constructions, medieval builders transformed abstract ratios into monumental stone, creating spaces that continue to teach principles of harmony, structure, and proportion to anyone who studies them carefully. By the 11th and 12th centuries after Christ, Europe saw the rise of cathedral schools and the earliest universities, creating formal spaces where learning could be pursued systematically. These institutions did not focus solely on theology and philosophy. They incorporated the liberal arts, including arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, as essential preparation for higher study. Geometry in this context gained an academic home. Students learned not only to calculate lengths and areas, but to understand ratios, proportions, and spatial relationships. Texts by Euclid, Boethius, and other classical authors were copied, studied, and commented upon, ensuring that the principles guiding cathedral builders and engineers were part of a broader intellectual framework. Teachers used diagrams, exercises, and demonstrations to show how geometric rules applied both to architecture and to theoretical problems. This technical literacy allowed educated individuals to read plans, understand measurements, and appreciate the logic behind construction. The growing number of schools created networks through which knowledge could travel. Students trained in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford could encounter similar texts and curricula, standardizing methods across regions. Geometry became a language shared between scholars, builders, and clerics. Its presence alongside theology reinforced the idea that understanding the natural and built world was a form of understanding God's creation. Practical applications included surveying, building, and organizing space in towns and ecclesiastical complexes, while theoretical instruction provided intellectual rigor. Manuscripts preserved in monastic libraries were increasingly supplemented with commentaries and examples illustrating geometric applications. Technical literacy meant that geometry was no longer confined to the hands of masons or specialized scribes, but became accessible to educated clerics and students capable of reasoning through abstract and applied problems. The quadrivium, consisting of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, served as both intellectual training and preparation for advanced theological study. In cathedral schools, young clerics learned how geometric ratios informed the layout of altars, the division of windows, and the spacing of columns, while also grasping abstract proofs and constructions that connected these measurements to mathematical theory. By combining practical knowledge with academic study, scholastic schools ensured continuity and refinement of geometric learning. Students were expected to question, calculate, and verify, reinforcing logic and precision. The revival of formal learning during this period laid the foundation for the Renaissance rediscovery of classical works, providing both methodology and context for interpreting inherited knowledge. Geometry became embedded in education as a tool for reasoning, planning, and understanding the world in measurable terms. The technical literacy developed in universities and cathedral schools allowed Europe to build structures, study the heavens, and develop scientific reasoning in ways that depended on centuries of preserved, transmitted, and now systematized knowledge. Sacred geometry, though not mystical, gained clarity and authority, linking theory with practice in a rigorous, teachable, and replicable form that influenced both architecture and intellectual life for generations. Gothic architecture, emerging in the 12th century after Christ, represents a deliberate fusion of engineering, aesthetics, and religious symbolism. Builders sought to elevate structures both physically and spiritually, using height and light to inspire awe and convey theological meaning. Ribbed vaults allowed for taller ceilings and wider spans while distributing weight efficiently, a principle derived from precise geometric calculation and centuries of inherited engineering knowledge. Flying buttresses transferred lateral forces outward, enabling walls to be pierced by large stained glass windows without compromising stability. These innovations were not arbitrary. Geometry guided every dimension, ratio, and angle, ensuring structural integrity while achieving a visual effect that directed the viewer's eye upward. Light became a tool of expression as much as illumination. Stained glass windows, often arranged in rows or lancet patterns, filtered sunlight into colored beams that highlighted altars, naves, and sacred spaces. The arrangement of windows followed proportional systems, sometimes based on simple ratios or modules that repeated throughout the building. This created harmony that was perceived intuitively, reinforcing the idea that order in architecture mirrored divine order. Cathedral interiors were carefully calculated. The spacing of columns, the height of arches, and the slope of vaults all adhered to ratios that maintained visual balance. Builders applied lessons learned from Roman engineering, Byzantine continuity, and classical Greek theory, all mediated through monastic scholarship. The emphasis on verticality and light was also theological. Height symbolized the ascent toward God, while light represented divine presence, knowledge, and guidance. Geometry made these symbolic gestures possible, translating abstract religious concepts into measurable, replicable forms. Every architectural decision, from the curvature of a ribbed vault to the division of a rose window, was informed by understanding of proportion and structural logic. Builders and clerics viewed this precision as a reflection of cosmic order, a tangible demonstration of God's rational creation. The Abbey of Saint-Denis, begun in the mid-12th century, exemplifies this integration. Its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and extensive clerestory windows established the blueprint for Gothic design across France and beyond. Successive cathedrals, including Chartres and Notre-Dame de Paris, extended these principles, demonstrating that geometry could support both innovation and tradition. Theatrical effects of light and shadow were not accidental. They were engineered through careful calculation of angles, distances, and proportions, reinforcing the spiritual atmosphere. The fusion of technical skill and symbolic meaning shows that sacred geometry was embedded in practice. Builders didn't need mystical insight. They needed knowledge, tools, and disciplined application of ratios, grids, and templates. Light, vaults, and the careful organization of space together created a coherent system that taught viewers about order, beauty, and the presence of the divine without words. Gothic architecture demonstrates how mathematics, craftsmanship, and theology could converge, producing structures that remain both structurally brilliant and spiritually evocative. Every vault and window is a lesson in applied geometry, revealing centuries' intellectual inheritance filtered through faith, skill, and artistic vision. By the 15th century after Christ, the Vatican Library emerged as one of the most important centers for the collection, preservation, and organization of knowledge in Europe. Established formally by Pope Nicholas V in 1448, the library gathered manuscripts from monasteries, churches, and private collections across Italy and beyond. It was not merely a repository, but a carefully structured institution with cataloguing systems that allowed scholars to locate, study, and copy texts. The Vatican recognized that preserving knowledge required both organization and protection. Manuscripts were stored on shelves according to subject, author, and language, creating an architecture of knowledge that reflected order as much as content. Greek, Roman, and medieval Latin texts were joined by translations from Arabic and Hebrew, including works on mathematics, astronomy, geometry, and philosophy. Scholars visiting the library could study Euclid, Boethius, Ptolemy, and Archimedes alongside theological treatises, creating a cross-disciplinary environment where abstract and practical learning coexisted. The design of the library itself mirrored these principles. Reading rooms, secure storage areas, and controlled access points allowed manuscripts to survive in good condition for centuries. Scribes and librarians were trained to handle texts carefully, annotate copies, and maintain accurate records of holdings. The library's growth reflected a broader strategy to centralize European knowledge under papal supervision, while still enabling study and scholarly discourse. By cataloguing texts according to subject matter and creating indices of authors and works, the Vatican provided a framework that later generations could navigate efficiently. Mathematics and geometry, often essential for understanding architecture and engineering, were included prominently. Diagrams, proofs, and treatises were preserved alongside religious works, ensuring continuity of technical knowledge. The library also served as a model for other European collections, demonstrating the importance of systematic organization for the survival of complex bodies of work. During the Renaissance, humanist scholars such as Poggio Bracciolini contributed to the Vatican Library by retrieving ancient manuscripts from monasteries and copying them for study, further enriching the collection. This process reinforced the idea that preserving knowledge required both acquisition and meticulous management. The Vatican Library was more than a building. It was a carefully constructed intellectual system. Its architecture, both physical and organizational, allowed centuries of accumulated wisdom to remain accessible to trained readers while protected from loss, fire, or decay. Geometry, astronomy, medicine, and classical literature all found a home within this structure, demonstrating that sacred and secular knowledge could coexist under a framework of disciplined preservation. The Vatican Library's role as a hub ensured that ideas could travel across generations, supporting education, construction, and scholarship. It exemplifies how the Church combined resources, organizational skill, and intellectual foresight to create a centralized institution where knowledge was not only stored, but made usable. Through cataloging, copying, and careful management, the library shaped how Europe understood, accessed, and applied the intellectual inheritance of antiquity and the Middle Ages. The Vatican archives, formerly known as the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, have long been the subject of fascination and speculation. Established officially by Pope Paul V in 1617, these archives contain documents spanning from the 8th century to the present day. Access to the materials is tightly controlled, but it is not a matter of a single locked door. Instead, a complex system of permissions, regulations, and administrative procedures governs who may view what. Scholars must submit formal requests specifying the exact documents they wish to consult. Approval depends on academic credentials, the purpose of research, and in some cases, the potential sensitivity of the information. Once admitted, access is supervised by trained archivists who ensure that manuscripts are handled properly and that the conditions of use are strictly observed. Photography, copying, and removal of materials are heavily restricted. Only a small fraction of the total holdings is available at any given time. This layered bureaucracy is designed to preserve fragile manuscripts while allowing scholarly work to continue. The archives contain correspondence between popes, papal bulls, legal documents, records of councils, and diplomatic communications. They also include materials on canon law, theology, and administrative matters. Mathematical, astronomical, and architectural texts are present, but often require precise justification to access. These collections are organized according to historical and thematic categories, allowing for systematic study while protecting the overall integrity of the holdings. The perception that the Vatican keeps its archives hidden for secrecy alone is an oversimplification. Preservation of documents that are centuries old requires controlled conditions, specialized handling, and careful documentation. Scholars who have been granted access describe a highly organized environment where manuscripts are stored in climate-controlled rooms and where each item is catalogued and tracked. Over the centuries, rules governing access have evolved. In 1659, Pope Alexander VII issued regulations clarifying who could enter and what materials could be examined. In 1966, Pope Paul VI reorganized the archives and increased transparency for qualified researchers, though the majority of documents remain inaccessible to the public. The archives are not a single chamber of forbidden knowledge, but a vast network of rooms, shelves, and vaults with overlapping rules. Each section may have distinct access requirements depending on the age, condition, and content of the documents. Understanding the Vatican archives requires recognizing both their scale and the logistical necessity of restricting access. Public fascination often exaggerates the notion of mystery, but the reality is practical. Centuries of documents, some delicate or rare, demand careful management to survive. Scholars benefit from this system when properly prepared, but it simultaneously limits general exposure, creating a perception of secrecy. Private archival control, therefore, reflects both stewardship and the complexity of managing knowledge accumulated over a millennium. This system ensures preservation while maintaining a structured, regulated means for the study of history, theology, and science. During the 15th century after Christ, Renaissance humanists embarked on a widespread search for ancient manuscripts, motivated by a desire to reconnect with the knowledge of Greece and Rome. Scholars such as Poggio Bracciolini travelled across Europe, visiting monasteries in remote regions of Italy Germany, and France, retrieving texts that had been neglected, forgotten, or misfiled. They sought works on mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and architecture, recognizing their importance for both intellectual and artistic pursuits. Patrons, including popes and wealthy citizens, funded these efforts, understanding that access to classical knowledge elevated cultural status and contributed to the revival of learning. The texts discovered included copies of Euclid's Elements, Archimedes' treatises, and writings on proportion and harmony, which had been preserved in monasteries and occasionally in private collections. Once recovered, manuscripts were copied, annotated, and studied in newly established libraries, including those attached to universities and cathedrals. Humanists emphasized accurate transcription, often comparing multiple sources to correct errors introduced by centuries of manual copying. This activity accelerated the reintegration of Greek mathematical ideas into Western Europe. Architects and artists studied these works and applied principles of proportion, symmetry, and geometric construction to painting, sculpture, and building design. The study of perspective, which emerged prominently in the 15th century, relied on a deep understanding of geometry drawn directly from these recovered texts. Mathematical ratios guided the dimensions of facades, the arrangement of windows, and the spatial organization of interiors. The revival of classical knowledge also influenced the education of scholars, with curricula at universities incorporating arithmetic, geometry, and the study of proportion alongside theology and philosophy. These subjects became practical tools for understanding the natural world and shaping human environments in line with reason and beauty. Manuscript hunting often involved negotiating access with monastic custodians and navigating complex networks of ownership and preservation. Some texts had been hidden or guarded due to perceived theological sensitivity, while others had simply fallen into obscurity. The effort to locate, authenticate, and copy these works created a culture of scholarly diligence and critical study, laying the groundwork for systematic analysis in later scientific inquiry. As recovered knowledge circulated, it informed architecture in Florence, Rome, and Venice, where buildings reflected careful application of ratios, modules, and harmonic principles derived from classical sources. Paintings and sculpture also benefited, with geometric grids and perspective lines guiding composition. By the end of the 15th century, the integration of Greek mathematics into European art and design was evident in cathedrals, palaces, and public spaces. Humanists ensured that ancient geometry was no longer dormant. It became active in shaping both physical structures and intellectual frameworks. The return of these texts marked a turning point, connecting centuries of monastic preservation, Byzantine continuity, and Islamic transmission with the creative explosion of the Renaissance. This rediscovery of classical mathematics provided the foundation for architecture and design that combined technical skill, aesthetic harmony, and intellectual rigor, demonstrating the enduring value of manuscripts carefully preserved and zealously sought by Renaissance scholars. During the 15th century after Christ, Renaissance thinkers and artists began formalizing rules of proportion that connected mathematics directly to art, architecture, and the human body. Leon Battista Alberti, writing in 1448, articulated in his treatise De Re Edificatoria how harmonic ratios could guide the design of buildings, emphasizing symmetry, modular measurement, and geometric clarity. Alberti argued that beauty was rooted in proportion and could be calculated, offering a systematic approach for architects to follow. This concept extended beyond structures to painting and sculpture, influencing how artists measured space, organized composition, and represented figures realistically. Leonardo da Vinci, working later in the 15th and early 16th centuries, exemplified the application of these principles. His Vitruvian Man demonstrates a precise study of human anatomy based on geometric ratios, connecting the body to architectural proportion and cosmic order. Artists and architects studied classical texts alongside Alberti's treatises to understand how squares, circles, and harmonic divisions could dictate form, ensuring that every element related to a larger, coherent system. Churches, palaces, and public spaces began to reflect this logic, with facades, domes, and interiors designed according to ratios derived from both human measurements and classical sources. The golden ratio, simple fractions, and modular grids became standard tools, providing a consistent vocabulary for design that could be taught, replicated, and expanded. This period also saw increased collaboration between scholars, engineers, and artists, who shared knowledge of geometry, perspective, and proportion to achieve coherent results. Measurements were recorded meticulously, templates were drawn for complex forms, and careful study ensured that both aesthetic and structural considerations were integrated. Proportion became a program rather than an intuitive process. Buildings were no longer constructed solely by experience. They followed calculated plans, informed by centuries of inherited mathematical knowledge, monastic preservation, and Renaissance humanist study. Paintings and sculpture incorporated these principles to create figures that felt balanced, natural, and expressive, while architecture conveyed harmony through spatial coherence and measured rhythm. This systematic application of geometry allowed for unprecedented clarity, uniting theoretical mathematics with practical execution. The approach reinforced the Renaissance ideal that humans, through reason and study, could understand and replicate the natural order, translating it into lasting works of art and architecture. In this way, Alberti, Leonardo, and their contemporaries bridged the intellectual traditions of classical Greece, Rome, and Byzantium with the creative ambitions of their own era. Sacred geometry, previously preserved in texts and monastic practice, became a visible, applied tool shaping the built and visual world. Every measured proportion in a facade, arch, or human figure demonstrates this legacy, showing that Renaissance innovation was as much about disciplined application of inherited knowledge as it was about individual creativity. Through careful study, documentation, and execution, the principles of harmony and proportion were formalized, creating a standard that influenced generations of artists, architects, and scholars for centuries. By the 16th century after Christ, geometric principles that had guided cathedral and church design began influencing broader aspects of urban planning. Renaissance architects and engineers applied proportional grids, symmetry, and harmonic ratios to the layout of streets, plazas, fortifications, and public spaces. Cities like Florence, Rome, and later Palma Nova in northern Italy became examples of this approach, where streets intersected at right angles, squares were designed with precise ratios, and defensive walls incorporated geometric shapes to optimize visibility and protection. The knowledge developed for sacred spaces proved adaptable, because the same rules of proportion, scale, and measurement could organize secular environments efficiently and aesthetically. Military engineers used geometric thinking to design bastions, star forts, and moats, combining structural stability with strategic advantage. Geometry dictated angles, distances, and alignments that enhanced defense while maintaining visual harmony. Surveying techniques refined for church construction, including the use of measuring rods, compasses, and triangulation, were applied to urban plots, ensuring that civic buildings, public squares, and streets aligned according to pre-planned modules. Cartographers similarly relied on proportional grids to create maps that represented both natural features and built environments accurately, demonstrating the spread of mathematical reasoning from sacred architecture into civic planning. Humanist scholars and engineers documented these techniques in treatises and manuals, circulating ideas that connected classical sources with contemporary applications. Alberti, for instance, in his writings on architecture, emphasized that order and proportion in urban spaces reflected civic virtue as well as aesthetic coherence. The principles of harmony, once reserved for cathedrals and chapels, became a cultural standard for entire communities. This integration of geometric reasoning into urban design reinforced social order, improved functionality, and reflected Renaissance ideals of reason, balance, and human mastery of space. Streets, squares, and city layouts were no longer arbitrary, but carefully calculated to achieve visual, structural, and symbolic harmony. Renaissance planners also considered human scale, ensuring that public spaces accommodated movement, sightlines, and human activity while adhering to proportional systems. The influence of sacred geometry extended beyond mere symbolism. It guided practical decisions about building alignment, orientation, and the distribution of communal spaces. Cities became three-dimensional diagrams, in which proportion and symmetry structured both physical and social interactions. As the century progressed, these ideas spread beyond Italy, into France, Spain, and the Low Countries, shaping the evolution of European urbanism. Fortifications, civic buildings, and street plans increasingly reflected the integration of classical geometry, technical knowledge, and cultural ideals. Sacred geometry had become broadly cultural, no longer confined to monasteries or cathedrals, but shaping how people lived, moved, and interacted in organized space. By applying the same principles used in religious architecture to civic design, Renaissance thinkers demonstrated that mathematical order could unify both spiritual and secular worlds, leaving a lasting imprint on the appearance and function of European cities for generations. By the 17th and 18th centuries, after Christ, geometric forms that had long served practical and aesthetic purposes began to acquire new symbolic interpretations through esoteric traditions. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and other secret societies explored the meanings of squares, circles, triangles, and the golden ratio, linking them to spiritual ideas, moral lessons, and philosophical principles. The tools of architects and masons, such as compasses and squares, were reinterpreted as symbols of ethical guidance, cosmic order, and human enlightenment. These groups often drew on Renaissance treatises, classical geometry, and monastic preservation of texts to legitimize their interpretations, blending historical knowledge with speculative meaning. Symbols that had originally guided construction and proportional planning became mnemonic devices, teaching moral and spiritual concepts to initiates. For example, the square and compass in Freemasonry represented precision, balance, and the disciplined pursuit of truth, while geometric patterns in Rosicrucian manuscripts were connected to metaphysical ideas of harmony and cosmic order. This layering of meaning did not erase the original function of geometry. Buildings, maps, and diagrams still followed precise ratios and measurements. Instead, symbolic overlays created multiple layers of understanding, where one form could be appreciated both for its technical accuracy and for its allegorical or mystical significance. Manuscripts, architectural sketches, and ritual diagrams served as educational tools within these groups, teaching both mathematics and philosophy in tandem. By studying harmonic ratios, pentagrams, and proportional systems, members could internalize lessons about balance, symmetry, and order in both physical and moral dimensions. The Renaissance recovery of classical geometry provided a foundation, giving these esoteric traditions credibility and depth. Scholars and initiates often referenced Euclid, Pythagoras, and Alberti, demonstrating that practical knowledge could support symbolic interpretation. Art and architecture also reflected this dual purpose. Cathedrals, civic buildings, and even private residences incorporated patterns and proportions that could be read literally by architects and masons, while conveying layered symbolic messages for those trained to interpret them. This period illustrates how historical geometry evolved into a cultural language that functioned simultaneously as a tool, a symbol, and a myth. Knowledge once confined to monasteries, schools, and building sites was adapted to philosophical, ethical, and spiritual frameworks, expanding its reach and resonance. By the 18th century, the association of geometry with hidden knowledge, initiation, and personal refinement was widespread among intellectual circles in Europe. Sacred forms retained their technical integrity while gaining additional symbolic power. This process shows how mathematical principles can acquire new meanings over time without losing their original precision, demonstrating the interplay between fact and interpretation. Geometry became not only a method for measuring and constructing, but also a medium through which culture, belief, and philosophy could be transmitted, creating layers of significance that endure in both material and intellectual heritage. The Vatican has accumulated one of the most comprehensive collections of manuscripts and documents in the world, providing a credible record of how geometry and mathematics have been studied, applied, and transmitted across civilizations. Established formally in 1448 by Pope Nicholas V, the Vatican Library and associated archives preserve texts from the ancient world through the Middle Ages and into the modern era. These include Greek and Roman treatises on mathematics, astronomy, and architecture, as well as medieval copies and translations produced in monastic centers throughout Europe. The manuscripts reveal the methods by which sacred geometry was used in the design of temples, churches, and later cathedrals, demonstrating consistent application of ratios, proportions, and harmonic principles. Records indicate that texts by Euclid, Archimedes, and Ptolemy were copied, studied, and sometimes annotated by clerics and scholars who understood both theoretical and practical implications. The Vatican also preserved commentaries and instructional works from the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, showing that knowledge was not confined to Western Europe, but part of a broader, interconnected intellectual tradition. Architectural plans, measurement notes, and treatises on proportion provide evidence of how geometry guided construction, while liturgical and philosophical writings illustrate the symbolic and cultural significance attached to mathematical forms. The archives document the continuity of learning from antiquity to the Renaissance, including the activities of humanists, masons, and scholars who integrated classical principles into new designs, both in sacred and secular contexts. The Vatican's institutional memory maintains records of the transmission of this knowledge through monastic copying networks, university curricula, and ecclesiastical patronage, demonstrating a systematic approach to preserving intellectual heritage. This corpus allows researchers to trace the evolution of geometric thinking from practical surveying and temple planning in Egypt and Mesopotamia, through Greek philosophical and mathematical formalization, to Roman engineering, medieval scholastic instruction, and Renaissance application in art, architecture, and urban planning. In plain terms, the Vatican's holdings provide a factual core, showing that sacred geometry was never merely symbolic or mystical. It was a practical, replicable system that guided the design of buildings, the layout of cities, and the study of the cosmos. The library's manuscripts, annotations, and administrative records reveal how clerics and scholars understood ratios, proportions, and modular systems, and how these principles were applied over centuries. These documents demonstrate a continuity of knowledge that spans cultures and eras, providing a tangible record of intellectual history. While later, interpretations, myths, and esoteric associations added layers of meaning, the foundational reality preserved in the Vatican collections shows that geometry was used deliberately and systematically. Sacred forms were tools for measurement, education, and planning, as well as for expressing philosophical and theological ideas. The Vatican's preserved materials therefore illuminate not only the technical aspects of geometry, but also its cultural, educational, and historical context, offering scholars an unparalleled window into the evolution of human understanding of proportion, harmony, and mathematical order across civilizations. Sacred geometry did not emerge from a single moment of revelation. Its origins are found in the continuity of human thought, practice, and preservation across millennia. From the early surveying and temple planning in Egypt and Mesopotamia, humans measured, divided, and organized space to serve practical, ritual, and aesthetic purposes. These methods were preserved in written and oral forms, passed along through generations, and adapted to new contexts. In Greece, mathematicians and philosophers like Pythagoras and Euclid formalized geometric principles, creating a system of ratios, proofs, and logical constructions that could be applied consistently. Geometry became both a tool for understanding the physical world and a framework for contemplating abstract ideas about harmony and proportion. The Romans integrated these principles into engineering and architecture, spreading modules, ratios, and proportional planning across cities, bridges, aqueducts, and monumental buildings. As the Western Empire declined, monastic centers in Europe and the Byzantine Empire preserved texts, copying them carefully, translating them, and maintaining a chain of knowledge that survived social upheaval. Clerics and scholars ensured that essential mathematical and architectural works were available for study, even if access was limited. During the Renaissance, humanists sought out these manuscripts, recovered Greek and Roman texts, and applied geometric knowledge systematically to art, architecture, and urban planning. Figures like Alberti and Leonardo da Vinci formalized rules of proportion, connecting the human body, buildings, and visual composition in ways that revealed underlying harmony. Geometry became a language that communicated structure, balance, and aesthetic coherence across multiple domains. Throughout this process, geometry was not mystical in origin. Its continuity demonstrates that practical calculation, observation, and theoretical reasoning guided its application. Religious and secular institutions alike maintained and transmitted knowledge, blending philosophy, theology, and mathematics into coherent systems that informed both practice and thought. Later, symbolic and esoteric interpretations added layers of meaning, but they were built upon an enduring foundation of practical, measurable principles. The Vatican and other repositories preserved texts and institutional memory that document this long chain, showing how forms, ratios, and spatial reasoning were employed intentionally across cultures. Sacred geometry is therefore the product of human diligence, intellectual curiosity, and careful preservation rather than a single divine revelation. Its evolution illustrates the cumulative power of learning, where discoveries are retained, adapted, and transformed by successive generations. Each cathedral, city plan, manuscript, and treatise reflects an unbroken lineage of observation, measurement, and application, linking ancient techniques to modern understanding. In this sense, the real secret origin of sacred geometry is continuity. It is the historical chain connecting civilizations, philosophical inquiry, practical craft, and theological reflection, demonstrating that the patterns and proportions we admire today are the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge thoughtfully preserved and applied. Sacred geometry is a testament to human ingenuity, persistence, and the ability to transmit understanding across time, showing that the shapes, ratios, and harmonies we see in art, architecture, and education are the visible outcomes of an enduring intellectual tradition.